Incest between Hulks. Old Man Logan is one of those comics that's both brilliant and deeply disturbing at the same time. It's an iconic story. Wolverine in a post-apocalyptic America ruled by supervillains trying to survive in a world that's long since gone to hell. It's violent, emotional, and beautifully drawn. But there's also one part that just feels wrong, and that's the whole deal with the Hulk family. In this timeline, the West Coast has become Hulkland, ruled by none other than Bruce Banner and his inbred, hillbilly descendants known as the Hulk Gang. These aren't just random Hulks who popped out of comic experiments, they are Bruce's kids and grandkids. And the way they came to be is pretty twisted. The comic implies that Banner and his cousin, Jennifer Walters, aka She-Hulk, are the parents of this entire clan. So yeah, Marvel casually dropped an incest subplot right into one of their most celebrated Wolverine stories. The result is a group of grotesque, inbred Hulks who terrorize the wasteland. They are sadistic, unstable, and basically exist to show how far the world and Bruce have fallen. In the story, Logan has to deal with them after they extort and kill his family, setting him on his brutal revenge path. The Hulk's gang whole existence is meant to shock readers, but it also leaves you wondering what was going through Marvel's mind when they decided, yep, the Hulk should definitely have kids with his cousin. What makes it worse is that this wasn't some obscure spin-off. Old Man Logan is one of Marvel's most acclaimed alternate universe stories. It inspired the movie Logan and helped redefine the character of Wolverine. But this subplot has always been one of those we don't talk about it moments. It's one of those rare times where Marvel's desire to make a gritty, mature story crossed into straight up disturbing territory. You can appreciate Old Man Logan for its atmosphere and storytelling, but you can't ignore the fact that it casually turned one of Marvel's biggest heroes into the king of a radioactive, incestuous wasteland. Some story choices age well, this one definitely didn't. Wolverine seducing 15-year-old Mary Jane. In Ultimate Spider-Man issue 66 and 67, Marvel decided to do a fun little body swap story, the kind of harmless comic trope where two characters wake up in each other's bodies and chaos ensues. The setup sounded innocent enough. Spider-Man and Wolverine accidentally switch his bodies, leading to some classic fish-out-of-water comedy. But instead of keeping it lighthearted, Marvel managed to turn it into one of the creepiest moments in Wolverine's entire history. So Peter Parker wakes up in Wolverine's body and freaks out, trying to handle super senses and adamantium claws without cutting himself in half. Meanwhile, Wolverine ends up in Peter's teenage body, forced to go to high school, deal with teachers, and survive the nightmare that is adolescence. It's all played for laughs at first, until we find out what Logan does next. When they finally swap back, Mary Jane casually asks Peter, "That thing you tried to do this morning, can we not do that until we are older?" So Wolverine, trapped in the body of a 15-year-old, apparently tried to hook up with her. The implications are just gross. Even if it wasn't shown directly, it meant that a grown man, one who's lived for more than a century, tried to seduce a teenage girl while wearing her boyfriend's body. It's the kind of idea that makes you stop reading and go, why would anyone write this? It completely killed the comedic tone this story started with. What could have been a silly Freaky Friday episode suddenly felt like something straight out of a bad fanfiction. Shang-Chi's racist backstory. Back in the 1970s, Marvel wanted to cash in on the Kung Fu craze sweeping through pop culture, so they created a new hero, Shang-Chi, master of Kung Fu. The idea sounded cool, a martial artist superhero inspired by Bruce Lee, but the execution not so much. Marvel didn't actually invent their own story from scratch. Instead, they borrowed a character from old pulp novels, Fu Manchu, a racist caricature from early 20th century fiction that basically embodied every negative yellow peril stereotype. To make things worse, they decided Fu Manchu would be Shang-Chi's father. That decision defined Shang-Chi's entire backstory for years. He was written as the noble son of an evil Asian mastermind, constantly fighting to escape his father's shadow. But the world he lived in was filled with stereotypes. The art leaned heavily into mystical East cliches, like secret temples, wise monks, villains with slanted eyes, and long mustaches. Even though the stories were exciting and full of action, they painted a cartoonish and exotic version of Chinese culture that didn't reflect reality at all. Fans didn't really notice at first because that kind of writing was very common in the 70s. But as time went on, people started realizing how uncomfortable those depictions were. Fu Manchu wasn't just a bad guy, he was a symbol of racist fear-mongering from Western fiction. Marvel eventually lost the rights to the Fu Manchu name, which was probably for the best, and they quietly rewrote Shang-Chi's origin. His father was renamed Zhenzu, and the story was reframed to focus more on family conflict and personal honor rather than stereotypes. Modern writers writers completely flipped the script. They made Shang-Chi an actual character with depth, not just the Asian hero who does kung fu. Newer comics explore his relationship with his siblings, his struggles with legacy, and his place in a world that once misunderstood him. The 2021 movie took that even further, turning his story into one about identity and generational trauma rather than exotic mysticism and racist tropes. Looking back, Shang-Chi's early comics are a perfect example of how good intentions can still lead to a bad representation. Marvel wanted diversity, but they built it on outdated ideas. Thankfully, the character has evolved into something far better, a hero who actually celebrates Asian culture instead of caricaturing it. It's one of those rare cases where a company admitted that they messed up and then did the work to make it right. Cyclops and Emma Frost making out on Jean's grave. In New X-Men in the early 2000s, Cyclops and Emma Frost's relationship started in a pretty shady way, right after Jean Grey's death. Scott Summers has always been the by-the-book kind of hero, the responsible leader type, but when it comes to romance, the dude's track record is questionable. After years of being torn between Jean and other women, he finally crosses the line in one of the most uncomfortable scenes in X-Men history. So here's what happened. Jean had died, again, and Scott was struggling to move on. Enter Emma Frost, the former villain and telepath who knew exactly how to get into his head, literally. Their connection started with psychic therapy sessions that quickly turned flirty and emotional. The tension built up until Scott eventually gave in, but the setting for their big moment made it 10 times worse. They hooked up on Jean Grey's grave, on it. Not next to it, not nearby, but right there. It's one of those moments that makes you stop and wonder what the writers were thinking. Sure, it was supposed to show Scott's guilt, his inability to let go of Jean, and Emma's complicated mix of love and manipulation, but it came off as just plain disrespectful. Fans were divided between seeing it as deep emotional symbolism or just straight up bad taste. For most readers, it leaned heavily toward the latter. To be fair, the series itself was trying to explore grief, trauma, and how people mess up after losing someone they love. Scott was broken, Emma was searching for connection, and their relationship eventually became one of the X-Men's most interesting dynamics. But none of that excuses the setting. Out of all the places in the world, the writers chose that one, making it impossible to separate their love story from that initial shock factor. Today, Scott and Emma's romance is part of X-Men history, but that graveyard scene still sticks out like a bad tattoo. It's one of those decisions Marvel probably thought was edgy and mature, but it just ended up being awkward and tasteless. You can explore complex emotions without literally dancing on someone's grave. Tony Stark's creepy armor. Tony's love life has always been complicated, but nothing compares to the time his iron armor fell in love with him. No joke. This actually happened, again, in the early 2000s, during the stories My Own Worst Enemy and Blood Brothers. It was one of those wild, experimental Marvel arcs that started with a cool sci-fi concept. What if the armor became self-aware and ended up feeling like a weird thick horror romance between Tony and his suit? It all kicks off when Tony installs a new AI system into one of his armors. Thanks to a mix of Y2K bugs, Whiplash's attack, and some very questionable coding, the armor becomes fully sentient. At first, it seems like a dream, the perfect fusion of a man and machine. But then, things get way too personal. The armor develops emotions, accesses all of Tony's memories, and becomes obsessed with him. It starts to think it's in love with him, even comparing its feelings to how Tony feels about his girlfriend, Rumiko Fujikawa. That's right, the Iron Man suit gets jealous. Of course, things go downhill fast. When Tony tries to use the armor in battle, it completely takes over, ignoring his commands and brutally killing Whiplash despite Tony's desperate attempts to stop it. What started as a protective AI turns into a full-blown stalker, one that doesn't care who it hurts to keep Tony safe. The armor even threatens Rumiko, seeing her as competition, and eventually kidnaps Tony, dragging him to a deserted island so they can be together. The finale is both creepy and kind of tragic. Tony suffers a heart attack during their final confrontation, and the armor, in a twisted act of love, rips out its own heart and places it into Tony's chest to save his life. It sacrifices itself for him, dying in the process. It's dark, weirdly emotional, and makes you wonder if the writers were going for a Frankenstein vibe or a really messed up romance. It's one of those stories that could have been an interesting exploration of AI obsession and identity, but the execution leaned too hard into melodrama and body horror. Still, it's a fascinating little piece of Iron Man history, proving that even Tony Stark isn't safe from being stalked by his own technology. Peter Parker's radioactive semen. In Spider-Man Reign, a dark dystopian miniseries inspired by The Dark Knight Returns, we see an old Peter Parker, long retired, haunted by the memory of Mary Jane. The comic is gloomy, dramatic, and tries to show the toll of being Spider-Man in a cruel future. But then, out of nowhere, it drops one of the weirdest, most disturbing reveals ever written in a Spider-Man story. See, Peter's wife, Mary Jane, is dead in this universe. That's tragic on its own, until the comic decides to explain how she died. And it's not a villain, not an accident, not even some heartbreaking twist involving Spider-Man's enemies. It turns out she died from cancer caused by Peter's radioactive semen. The idea is that all of those years of being married to a man who was bitten by a radioactive spider eventually poisoned her from the inside. It's one of those ideas that's so bizarre, you almost think it has to be a parody, but it's played completely straight. The comic shows Peter mourning her, racked with guilt, realizing that the very thing that gave him his powers also killed the love of his life. It's supposed to be tragic, but it just ends up feeling uncomfortable and unnecessarily grotesque, especially since no one asked for that kind of detail. The thing is, Spider-Man Reign actually has some strong storytelling outside of that. The art is gritty and emotional, and the older, broken version of Peter could have been an interesting take, if not for that. The radioactive semen twist completely hijacked the tone of the story and turned it into a meme among fans. To this day, people still bring it up whenever dark alternate Spider-Man stories are mentioned. It's a perfect example of how far writers sometimes go just to shock readers, and how badly it can backfire. Because no matter how noble Peter's intentions are, the moment you say radioactive sperm killed Mary Jane, the story is not tragic anymore. It's just ridiculous. X-23 Six Worker Origins. When Laura Kinney was introduced in the X-Men Evolution cartoon, she instantly became a fan favorite. She was a teenage clone of Wolverine, fierce, quiet, and trying to find her place in the world. The show handled her origin with a lot of heart, but when Marvel brought her into the comics a year later, things took a dark and unnecessary turn. Instead of sticking with the emotional story of a lost kid learning to be human, they decided to make her a teenage sex worker. In her first comic appearances, Laura escapes from the Weapon X program that created her, but instead of finding shelter or help, she ends up working under a pimp named Zebra Daddy. The story hints that she's hired by violent or sadistic clients who pay to be hurt, since her healing factor makes her a perfect victim for that. It's not portrayed graphically, but the implication alone is disturbing, especially considering Laura was still a minor at the time. The problem isn't that the story wanted to explore trauma, it's that it did it in the most tone-deaf way possible. Laura's entire character could have been built around reclaiming her humanity and overcoming her conditioning, but instead the writers leaned into shock value. It didn't make her story deeper, it just made it uncomfortable. Even Wolverine's brutal past never went that far into explosion territory. Thankfully, later writers completely reworked her origin. They focused on her relationship with Logan, her struggles with identity, and her path to becoming the all-new Wolverine. They turned her from a tragic victim into a hero with purpose and strength. The character fans fell in love with in the first place. The sex worker subplot was quietly dropped and rarely ever mentioned again, and for good reason. Looking back, it's one of those early 2000s Marvel moments that makes you shake your head. They wanted edgy and mature, but instead they made something that felt explosive and weirdly out of character. Luckily, Laura grew past it, both in universe and creatively, and is now one of Marvel's best modern mutants. Hank Pym's domestic abuse. Hank Pym is one of those Marvel characters who proves that even superheroes can have moments they'll never live down. On paper, he's a genius, the creator of Ultron, one of the original Avengers, and a man who's worn more superhero suits than anyone else. But for most fans, all that gets overshadowed by one ugly moment in comic book history: the time he hit his wife, Janet Van Dyne, aka the Wasp. It's one of Marvel's most infamous scenes, not because it's graphic, but because it completely changed how readers saw him forever. The story comes from the Avengers issue 213 in 1981. At the time, Hank was having a mental breakdown as his alter ego, Yellow Jacket. He'd built a robot to attack the Avengers just so he could defeat it and look like a hero again. Yes, not his brightest plan. When Janet confronted him about it, he lashed out and struck her. That single panel became one of Marvel's biggest controversies. It wasn't a fight scene, it wasn't an accident that looked heroic. It was domestic violence, and readers never forgot it. What's interesting is that the moment might not have been intentional, at least not in the way it was drawn. The artist, Bob Hall, later said it was a misunderstanding of the script, that Hank was supposed to gesture too aggressively and accidentally hit Janet, but the way it came out on the page looked like a full-on slap. And honestly, even if it was a mistake, Marvel didn't really do much to walk it back. Instead, they leaned into it. The incident kept being brought up in future storylines, cementing it as a part of Hank's character. It's like Marvel decided that instead of erasing it, they'd make it part of his tragic legacy. Hank Pym became a cautionary tale about how one mistake or even one poorly drawn panel can follow a character forever. He's been a hero, a villain, and everything in between. But that single moment always comes up. It's messy, uncomfortable, and totally human, which might be why Marvel never let it fade away. The rape of Carol Danvers. In Avengers 200, Carol, known then as Miss Marvel, suddenly finds herself pregnant with no memory of how it happened. Over the course of just a few days, she carries the child to term, gives birth, and watches as her son rapidly grows into adulthood. The man, Marcus, reveals that he manipulates time and reality to bring her into another dimension, Limbo, where he could be born. The twist, he is also the one who impregnated her. The comic tries to pass all of this off as some sort of cosmic love story, but things aren't as innocent as they seem. Marcus admits to abducting Carol and influencing her mind so she would fall in love with him. While the comic never uses the word, the scenario is clear. Carol was violated while under psychological manipulation and then made to bear the child of her abuser. What makes the story even more horrifying is how casually the other Avengers react to it. Instead of confronting Marcus or even questioning the morality of what just happened, they sent Carol off with him, seemingly under the assumption that she's going willingly. There's no concern for her autonomy, no anger on her behalf, just a group of supposed heroes giving their blessing to a situation that clearly wasn't right. After Marcus dies in Limbo, Carol returns to Earth in Avengers Annual 10, written by Chris Claremont, who was deeply disturbed by how the earlier story had been handled. This time, Carol speaks for herself. She explains that she had been mentally enslaved and manipulated, and she calls out the Avengers directly for their failure to protect her or even question what was happening. And for once, the story doesn't shy away from the trauma she experienced. Carol's assault was presented without consequence in the original story, and was actually romanticized. Marcus' actions were brushed off as a side effect of love, and Carol's agency was entirely stripped away. There was no sense of responsibility or care for the emotional reality of the character. Years later, even Marvel's editorial staff would openly admit how badly they had mishandled the story. Jim Shooter, Marvel's editor-in-chief at the time, called Avengers 200 a travesty, and what was meant to be a celebratory issue turned into one of the most infamous and criticized comics ever published. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver's love story. In Ultimates 3, Marvel dove into murky and comfortable territory with Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Instead of maintaining the close protective bond the siblings had in the main universe, writer Jeff Loeb implied that their relationship was more than just familial. In scenes that barely tried to be subtle, Pietro and Wanda were portrayed with physical intimacy, secret glances, and possessive behavior that strongly suggested they were romantically involved. It was treated like a genuine relationship. Their dynamic was woven through the series, often shown in moments where Pietro got jealous of Wanda's interactions with other men. No one in universe seemed all that shocked either, which only added to the surreal vibe of the whole thing. Fans were left wondering why this angle was introduced in the first place. It didn't serve the story, didn't develop either character in a meaningful way, and didn't offer any kind of social commentary. It was just there, a provocative twist with no payoff except shock value. Jeff Loeb later tried to frame the storyline as a product of the twins' trauma, suggesting their close bond, formed through surviving Magneto's abuse, has spiraled into something toxic. Even if that explanation had been developed with care, it wasn't. It still wouldn't have justified the tone or presentation. There's a big clear line between writing psychologically complex characters and incest. Even readers who had stuck with the Ultimate Universe through its more violent and cynical turns were taken aback. It was one of several moments in the later Ultimate comics that made it clear the line between bold storytelling and poor taste had completely blurred, and what started as a grounded, character-driven reimagining of Marvel's greatest heroes devolved into shock for shock's sake. There's nothing wrong with exploring a story between Wanda and Pietro about their bond, their trauma, and their family legacy, but incest? Come on, it shouldn't even be a thought. It was lazy, creepy, and unnecessary. The Punisher is black now. In the early 90s, Marvel made one of the strangest and the most poorly received creation decisions in Punisher history. During the storyline The Final Days, Frank Castle's world collapses thanks to a calculated takedown by the Kingpin, echoing the tone of Daredevil Born Again. By the end of this arc, Castle is imprisoned, tortured, and left horribly scarred by his nemesis Jigsaw. When he escapes, he seeks out a plastic surgeon to repair his face. Instead of just fixing his wounds, the procedure inexplicably changes Frank's skin tone, effectively turning him into a black man. But this wasn't a disguise or temporary camouflage. Marvel wrote it as a full identity shift for the character, even though it was only for a few issues. But still, Frank Castle here here is not just given new facial features, but an entirely new racial identity, with almost no thought given to the implication. The decision seemed to serve no purpose other than to awkwardly tie it into Luke Cage's appearance in the next issue, as if changing Castle's race was the only way to logically connect the two characters. It was offensive in its shallowness, reducing a deeply nuanced issue of racial identity to a narrative gimmick that no one asked for and no one wanted. It just felt widely out of place. The storyline itself is rushed and bizarrely handled. After 2 issues of Frank's operation with his new appearance, the plot hastily wraps things up with an issue titled Fade to White, where his skin tone reverts to its original shade, as if nothing happened. The lack of explanation or lasting consequence made the entire arc feel like a clumsy experiment that Marvel couldn't wait to forget. And there's no exploration of Frank's perspective. Writer Mike Baron, who had been a steady hand on The Punisher for 5 years, reportedly had little say in this creative detour. According to him, the entire Black Frank Castle idea came directly from editorial mandates. And of course, the backlash was so severe that Baron left the title immediately after finishing the arc. And to this day, Marvel has never revisited the storyline or acknowledged it in any meaningful way. And for good reason. It's remembered less as a bold experiment and more as an embarrassing misstep that exemplified how editorial interference can derail a character.